Hello and welcome to this seminar on fertilizer planning for profitability. My name is Stan Lalor. I'm the head of specialty business for Grassland AGRO, and I formerly worked with Teagasc both as an advisor, but for longer as a soil fertility and nutrient management researcher in Johnstown Castle. I was involved with the IFA Smart Farming Programme in the very early stages of the programme development, collaborating with the IFA at that time on behalf of Teagasc and also with the Fertiliser Association of Ireland. Fertiliser planning is something I've been very involved in for many years, and currently within Grassland AGRO, I'm very involved with the team of trained specialist agronomy advisors that we have working on a daily basis with farmers, preparing and implementing fertiliser plans on their farms, and we are available to help any farmer to do that who wishes to avail of that service. In today's seminar, I'm going to cover three topics. One and to introduce the topic, just briefly discuss why do a fertiliser plan or why plan your fertiliser for the farm. The second thing I'll discuss is when preparing a fertiliser plan, what are the important things to consider in terms of some of the key priorities for different nutrients and different approaches, particularly in a grassland context. And finally then, I'll cover off just some pointers regarding the implementation of a plan. It's one thing to prepare a plan, but it's another thing to follow it through and implement it and track how the plan has gone and put that plan in place. So implementing the plan is just as important and more important than preparing it. So we'll cover that as well. So firstly, for some introductory comments in terms of why we would prepare a fertiliser plan for a farm, and the three areas I cover here are cost benefits, resource utilisation, and also environmental considerations as well, all of which are very important. So when we think about why bother with fertiliser planning, the key thing which springs to mind straight away is the amount of money that's being spent every year on fertiliser. So if we look at nationally, we spend about 500 million euro per year in the sector on fertilisers. We spend another about 20 million euro per year on lime. Now they're fine in terms of national figures, but at an individual farm level, fertiliser and lime combined across all of the farming enterprises are a very significant direct or variable cost, amounting to 15 to 20% of the direct or variable costs on most farms. So with such a level of investment going into fertiliser and nutrient inputs, it makes sense to plan them accordingly to make sure you get return on investment. And the way to get return on investment is to make sure you capitalise on the potential productivity benefits. And we all know the headlines here that would get talked about in terms of the various nutrients. For example, a lime application is said to give a 7 to 1 return on investment on the cost of the lime compared to the increased grass production or increased crop production because of correcting the pH. Phosphorus, for example, has been shown that where P index can be improved from index 1, which is low, back up to the target index 3, that can be worth in the region of 1.5 tons per hectare of extra annual grass dry matter production by virtue of having a plan in place to fix the P fertility. Likewise, very strong correlation between the impact of potassium nutrition and grass, particularly silage yields. Likewise, nitrogen, which is the nutrient we spend most money on, is very closely linked in terms of its efficiency to other nutrients such as sulfur, phosphorus, potassium, and many others as well. So having the overall balance of nutrients right in your fertiliser plan is a great help in terms of getting the overall efficiency and return on investment from the fertiliser inputs. Additionally, when it comes to fertiliser planning, it's also important to remember that it's not just about planning the purchases of fertilisers that you're going to make. There's a lot of resources available within the farm that need to be exploited as well. One example, of course, is linked to soil pH in terms of the background release of nutrients from the soil. But in this example, I'm just taking an example of the slurry produced on a dairy farm. And as an example, if we take 40 hectare farm with 100 dairy cows, depending on your storage period and so on and the length of your winter, but to say that farm would produce about 550 meters cubed of slurry, which would be equivalent to 120,000 gallons, would be a good estimate for the annual slurry production from 100 dairy cows. Now, if you look at the nutrient content, the fertiliser value of the nutrient content of that slurry, and while it varies a little bit with application timing and method, the figures there would come out at somewhere in the region of 550 kilograms of nitrogen, 275 kilograms of P, and a big 1,925 kilograms of K that will be in that slurry as a potential fertiliser source, provided the slurry is used correctly. And if you were to go and buy the nutrients, the equivalent nutrients in fertiliser, the bill for those nutrients would be somewhere in the order of €2,500, which would correspond to about 20% of the overall fertilizer bill on a farm that size with that stocking rate. So you can see it's just an example of the potential of the resource that slurry is within the farm in terms of its impact on the fertilizer bill. So if that slurry is used correctly in accordance with a good plan, it could save you that amount of money in fertilizer. But likewise, if the slurry was being improperly used and not being applied to complement the fertilizer plan, well, then you might end up spending that €2,500 on fertilizer that you wouldn't need to if the slurry was managed a little bit more carefully. So it's an example of the potential savings by keeping everything in balance, be it lime, be it slurry, be it fertilizer, and so on. Likewise, and finally, in terms of just the reasons why you would prepare a fertilizer plan, is that the whole environmental area and sustainability very closely linked, whether it's biodiversity, whether it's air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, ammonia, or whether it's water quality in terms of river quality and groundwater quality. All of those are very closely linked and related to what we do with nutrients on our farms. So, and linking back to the whole concept of farming within nature, we want to remain productive and get the best we can out of our soil and hectare resources. But it's important to manage those nutrients effectively, avoid leakages, avoid losses. That means we get the best return on investment from the efficiency of the nutrients, but also do as little damage as possible in terms of the externalities, be it environmental, biodiversity, air quality, or water quality as well. So a good fertilizer plan helps strike the balance there to keep everything as it should be. So that's just a little introduction in terms of why do a fertilizer plan. The next topic then is to look maybe in a little bit more detail at some of the nutrients and some of the approaches, particularly in a grassland context, comparing grazing and dairy situations and so on. But the things to consider and prioritize when putting together a fertilizer plan. And the topics here will be lime, the rates and timings of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, and then also how slurry and silage ground might link in, particularly comparing silage ground to grazing ground. So the first point, and it's not to labour the point in terms of the benefits of lime application, they're well known, they're well understood. Having the optimum soil pH is so important for the efficiency of everything else that's going to happen in the soil, whether it's grassland, longevity of reseeded pastures, whether it's the efficiency of soil mineralization of nitrogen, whether it's the availability of fertilizer phosphorus. All of those things come back to having a pH optimized for the crop you're growing. And in the case of grassland, we're targeting a pH of in the region of 6.3 for that. So the key message here is if your soil has a low pH, spreading lime is an essential part of the fertilizer plan as any other nutrient, because having that lime spread and the pH corrected will be a very important factor in getting return on investment from all the other nutrients that you put into the soil. So the first thing to do when you get a soil test result is look at the pHs, look at the lime requirement, and act accordingly to get the lime out. Moving on from that then into some of the other nutrients, and I suppose to look at nitrogen. First of all, nitrogen is the nutrient by far that's most money is spent on. It's the biggest single nutrient input in terms of the fertilizer business. And really, I suppose a few things to watch on the nitrogen is, first of all, the overall N rate will be matched to stocking rate. And the stocking rate, the reason it's linked to stocking rate is because the stocking rate determines the grass or feed demand on the farm, whether that's demand for graze grass over the summer or whether that's demand for the amount of silage you're going to need. But timing of nitrogen is something which is very critical as well, and more critical for nitrogen probably than any other nutrient. And the slide here, the graph there just shows work from James Humphreys, which is the basis really for a lot of the fertilizer nitrogen advice we've had in Ireland now for about 15 years. And it's a complicated chart, but it just shows the linkage between the grass growth pattern or the grass growth curve, the background nitrogen release from the soil, and the approach when it comes to fertilizer applications being to fill the gap between what the grass needs to achieve its growth potential in terms of its N requirement uptake to do that, and what the soil can release on any given day. So as you can see, the grass growth curve, which is the top line, is tracking the typical grass growth curve we would be familiar with summer peak and falling off at the spring and the autumn period. And the lower line is showing the fact that the mineralization of soil nitrogen is slightly higher as the soil temperatures are warmer in the summer months compared to the spring, autumn, and winter periods as well. So filling that gap there really determines the little and often approach and the rate of nitrogen required at any time. And a graph like that is simplified in the Chagas Green Book, which is shown on the right-hand side of slide 9. It shows the top table is a table for dairy cows, showing that how at differing stocking rates, the nitrogen rate is affected. The overall nitrogen rate is affected by the differing stocking rates, but also the timing of nitrogen is affected by the different stocking rates, because the stocking rate in the system will interact to change that grass demand over the year. Likewise, on the bottom table, you can see the example there is for sucker calf to weaning production systems on the beef side. And again, you can see stocking rate determining the overall rate, but again, the pattern of nitrogen application matches the grass growth curve. And when you're planning your nitrogen applications over the year, tables like that are very useful references in terms of targeting the right amounts of nitrogen at different times of the year. And the key priority when it comes to nitrogen is looking at getting the nitrogen out in front of the growth, so that the nitrogen is there so the grass can achieve its potential, or what's required in terms of grass production based on stocking rate. Moving on to phosphorus and potassium, which is a little bit more straightforward than nitrogen, and the reason for that is that nitrogen is a very leaky element in the soil. It's associated with a lot of environmental issues, be it water quality or air quality, and the reason for that is that it tends not to hang around in the soil for very long. P and K, on the other hand, are quite different in that they're more stable, so we tend to get away with less frequent applications across the year. But nonetheless, the timing of P and K is still important in terms of what they do in the soil, particularly in terms of the requirements of grass. And we talk about P and K, we talk about a maintenance program, which is driven based on offtake, whether it's dairy milk offtake of P and K and milk in a dairy system, or in meat in a sheep or beef system. We talk about a maintenance rate, which is basically matching the offtake across the grazing platform. And in terms of the maintenance rates that will be applied, the advice when it comes to particularly phosphorus is to front load phosphorus application. So if you have a requirement of 20 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus across the year, get half to 3/4 of that P out in an application in the spring. And the reason why P is so important in the spring is twofold. Firstly, P availability in the soil is quite low, as the soil temperatures are low in the spring before the soil warms up. Secondly, the requirement of P and the yield response of grass to phosphorus is highest in the spring period as well. So you might say, why not put all the P out in the spring on that basis? And that you could do that, but it is also advised to hold back a small amount of P for a couple of drip feeds across the summer as well. And that's more to keep the P concentration in the herbage high enough to meet the dietary requirements of the animals. So overall, in terms of your maintenance program, and K will generally follow P, even though the requirement for K is not so high in the spring, but certainly for P, front load half to 3/4 of the P in the spring, and then a little bit of a drip feed to make up the remainder. Now, when it comes to build-up rates, which are extra again, so the top of that graph shows maintenance program. If you have a certain amount of the farm that is low in P, that needs extra P for build-up, target that application early in the spring. Get that out in February, March, April period, because that's when the grass will respond best and will be suffering most from the deficiency of P in the soil. However, potassium, on the other hand, and K is shown that the best time for extra K is late in the autumn. And the reason for that is that if you go and apply extra K too early in the year, particularly in the spring, it can impact on increasing the risk of the farm to grass tetany, because excess K in the spring can upset magnesium uptake. So for that reason, the advice for low P soils is to apply extra P in spring, but for low K soils, apply extra K in the fertilizer plan in the late summer or autumn period. One little caveat when it comes to phosphorus is that when it comes to P on peaty soils, the rules and the advice is slightly different. And the reason for that is that the chemistry of P on peat soils or black soils does behave a little bit differently, in that the P is not as attracted to the soil to the same extent as it would be in mineral soils. And for that reason, the approach for P on peaty soils is to apply little and often across the year. And also, generally, irrespective of the soil index, you would apply maintenance rates. So because the soil, organic soils don't have the same capacity to hold on to P, they don't have, the index system is not as appropriate in that case. So little and often across the year, and no build-up when it comes to peaty soils. The other nutrient, we've mentioned nitrogen, P and K at this stage, but nitrogen and sulfur are very closely linked together, and sulfur has increased in its importance and its relevance as a nutrient in recent years. And really, why nitrogen and sulfur are so closely related is that they interact very closely to allow the grass to make protein out of the nitrogen that it takes up. The main role of nitrogen in a plant is so that the plant can produce protein, and sulfur is very important in that process. The other reason why nitrogen and sulfur are linked is that they do behave quite similarly in the soil, in that neither of them would be as stable as nutrients like P and K, so they do lend themselves towards more little and often application rates. The key advice for sulfur is not necessarily the rate of sulfur, but it's fair to say that when you're looking at the sulfur that should be applied, you need to look at the nitrogen as well, and the reason for that is because of the linkage between the two. And as a rule of thumb, if for every 12 units or 12 kilograms of nitrogen you're spreading across the year in your fertilizer program on a given field, if 1 unit of sulfur balances every 12 units of nitrogen, or 1 kilo of sulfur balances every 12 kilos of nitrogen, that would be the right balance of nitrogen with sulfur to make sure that both are allowing each other to work correctly in the plant. You can overuse sulfur, and excess sulfur application has in the past been associated with some trace element imbalances, particularly copper and selenium. But that 12-to-1 ratio, keeping within that 12-to-1 ratio over the whole year, is pretty much matches the requirements of the grass. So that would be the advised approach. Finally, just in relation to some of the priorities on a fertilizer plan, and something maybe which gets maybe forgotten about a lot, is the key to be aware of the difference between what happens with nutrients in a field, particularly P and K in a field, when a sward is grazed compared to when it's cut. And I'm going to show an example to illustrate this. So if we take a ton of grass dry matter that's grown in a field, and if we take a scenario where that is being grazed, in this case by a dairy cow, but the exact same would be the case if it was a beef animal as well. A ton of grass eaten by a dairy cow will mean the intake by the dairy cow will be about 4 kilograms of P and 30 kilograms of K. That would be the typical P and K content of a ton of grass dry matter. But if we think about what happens at P and K when it's in the cow, a cow or an animal will actually excrete a lot of that P and K back through their dung and urine onto pasture as they're grazing. So in the case of P, they'll excrete about 60% of it back out, mainly through the dung. In the case of K, it's even higher. It's 90% of the K will be excreted back out, mainly through the urine. So that means the actual offtake off the field, whether it's milk or whether it's live weight, is 40% of the P that's eaten, or 10% of the K. So the overall offtake, even though the intake by the cow was 4 kilograms of P, only 1.6 kilograms of P will leave that field in milk production. Likewise with K, 30 kilograms of K was eaten by the cow, but only 3 will leave the field in terms of removal in milk production. Now, that's grazing scenario. Compare that to if we take the same ton of grass dry matter, but instead of grazing it with an animal, we cut it for silage. In this case, a baler, but it could be a silage harvester as well. Now, if you compare the P and K harvested, it's actually identical to the intake by the cow above, 4 kilograms of P and 30 kilograms of K. But the difference when we are cutting it for bales or for silage is that you remove 100% of that P and 100% of the K out of the field. And that means your removal from the field is 4 kilograms of P and 30 kilograms of K. And now you can see, comparing the removal in the grazing scenario, which was 1.6 and 3 of P and K respectively, we now remove 4 and 30 when we cut it. And in a nutshell, what that means is that the difference between cutting compared to grazing the same ton of grass dry matter means you remove 2.5 times more P and 10 times more K out of a field when you cut it for bales or for silage than you do if you graze it. And that has a big impact on what you might do with your fertilizer nutrient applications if a field is being cut for silage compared to if a field is being cut for grazing or being grazed by animals. Linked to that, it brings in the importance and the role of slurry in the overall balance of P and K across the farm. If you think about the previous slide where we mentioned the fact that the offtakes of P and K are higher in silage, that doesn't necessarily mean the P and K has left the farm completely. It just means that the P and K has left the field. And if you follow that through, the logic of it is that the P and K has left the silage field and gone to the silage pit, which means it's going to go through the animals over the winter period, and those nutrients are going to end up in the slurry tank. So if you take 1,000 gallons of thick slurry, and it is important to differentiate the difference between thick and dilute slurry in this sense, but typically if you were to go and buy a 50 kilo bag of fertilizer that was equivalent to the fertilizer value of 1,000 gallons of slurry, it would be a 50 kilo bag of 5,530 in terms of NPK. Now, the important thing to remember about a fertilizer, if you take a 5,530 fertilizer, is that the ratio of P and K in that slurry is 1 unit of P for every 6 units of K. Now hold that thought for a second and compare the P and K requirements of a grazing field compared to a silage field. Typically over the course of a year, depending on your stocking rate, the ratio of P and K in most graze scenarios, unless there are big differences in the soil P and K indexes, will be about 1 to 2. So your typical program for grazing would have 2 parts K for 1 part P in your fertilizer nutrient applications over the year. However, for silage, because of the high offtake, particularly of K in a silage crop, because you don't have the recycling of the K by the animals, the ratio of P and K requirement will be 1:6. Now go back and compare your slurry, which is a PK ratio of 1:6. It's a very well balanced fertilizer in terms of P and K for silage. It is not so well balanced if you're putting slurry on grazing ground. It does work and can be appropriate where you have a high P index but a low K index on grazing ground. But generally where you're applying a lot of slurry to grazing ground, it means you are probably applying excess K on grazing ground and you're having to buy more K than you need to keep the soil fertility in the silage field right. So the balance of slurry and targeting slurry towards silage ground is a very important consideration in the fertilizer plan as well. That brings us to the final part of the presentation, which is around implementing the plan. So I've talked about the reasons why you would do a plan. I've mentioned a few priorities in terms of the thought process of putting the plan together in terms of timings and application rates of nutrients and slurry. But now when it comes to implementing the plan, just to touch on a few comments around making sure the plan gets implemented along the lines of keeping it simple, make the plan easy to follow, getting your equipment right, and finally a word on record keeping. So when it comes to decision time, I often describe the key moment when a fertilizer plan works or doesn't work is the point where a farmer is in his yard, he has maybe 3 or 4 different fertilizer products available to him lined up against the wall in the yard, the spreader is on the tractor, and you're scratching your head and you're wondering what bag is going in the spreader and what field do I go to with it and what rate do I spread at. And at that point you need a very simple piece of information to guide you, and a huge pile of sheets and sheets of paper is not what you need. You need simple information to be able to put the plan in place, and that's what a good plan should be in terms of keeping it simple. And just as a few guidelines in terms of keeping a plan simple, the approach that I would generally recommend and we use in Grassland AGRO is to put a backbone program together for the farm, a simple plan across each round across the year. Focus on the priorities we've already mentioned, and that will be early phosphorus application, looking at the nitrogen rates across the year and the sulfur balance of that, and also looking at how best to put in late summer autumn K if and when it's needed. The best approach is to look at the best fit or a good fit for the average situation on the grazing or silage block. It gets very complicated very quickly when you look at different combinations of indexes. But if you can get the best fit for the average situation and keep the plan as uniform as possible across the farm, and within that keep as few products as possible at any one timing, that can make the plan simple and easy to follow and implement across the year and avoid confusion at each individual application timing. You could stop there and say, well, sure, an average plan across the farm would do me, and everybody does that because everybody has a simple program in itself. But the key thing extra to that is don't forget the fields that have the low P levels or the low K levels, or the high P or the high K if that be the case, and make those adjustments where required. Keep those adjustments simple. It might only take 1 or 2 very simple adjustments in the spring to apply the extra P for build-up. It might only take 1 or 2 very simple adjustments in the autumn to apply extra K. But make sure that you keep those simple, and that means they will be easy to implement on those couple of rounds of fertilizer where maybe something slightly different is required in certain fields because of the given soil fertility situation. But those little guidelines are a help in terms of targeting how to keep a plan as simple as possible, because if it's simple to follow, it'll be simple to implement. A very important development in fertilizer planning, which is becoming more available, is the simplicity provided by simple outputs in a fertilizer plan facilitated by mapping. And 2 examples here shown on this slide show the lime on the left, a lime application map. So you don't need all of the other information about nitrogen and phosphorus and soil indexes and so on the day you're spreading lime. That map makes it very simple for a lime contractor to come in and say that field A gets such or such a rate, field B gets a different rate, and I don't go into the third field at all. Very easy to follow, very easy to see, and you only need that piece of information on the day you're spreading lime. Likewise, on the right, you have your slurry application map. You can see the fields in brown get the slurry, the fields that aren't brown don't. You can also see the rate of slurry is different in a couple of the fields, so that's very easy to see as well. And that's the only piece of information you need on the day when you have the slurry to be spread. So you can see mapping does help to visualize and bring to life the fertilizer plan in a way that tables don't. And there are many emerging technologies and services available, particularly with the likes of the NMP Online from Teagasc is producing these kinds of maps. Products like Pharma and other products as well are developing very rapidly to make this information very accessible and help simplify the fertilizer planning process. Another important thing which often many of the paper-based plans don't go far enough with is the idea of showing what the product rate and choice should be across the different timings across the year for each field or each block of land. And this is something we focus on very much with the fertilizer plans that we do. And an example here just shows very simply for a given field or a given block of land, you can see at different times the different products and the rate of that product and what that would mean in terms of nutrient applications as part of a fertilizer plan. Again, similar to the mapping on the previous slide, it can just help bring to life and simplify the decision to be made on any given day, because if you're at a given timing, you just have to look at the right piece of information there and you know what product and away you go in terms of the rate. And again, it helps with the overall implementation. Another key aspect which helps a lot when it comes to the actual purchase of fertilizers is a fertilizer plan that brings together a simplified shopping list for the farm. So this example just shows you have 3 blocks. You have the fertilizer and lime for field or block A, plus the fertilizer lime for field or block B, and add the fertilizer lime for field or block C. Put that all together, and now you have a very simple shopping list, which is 12 tons of product one, 20 tons of another product, and so on in the example. And that makes it very straightforward when it comes to actually picking up the phone or going into the co-op or the merchant and actually buying your fertilizer, because you know exactly what your shopping list is. And when you go back and put that together with your plan, you know and you can take comfort that that list adds up to what the farm actually needs. Also, when it comes to if you're shopping around or getting value, having that simplified shopping list is a big help in terms of being very clear on what you want when it comes to actually buying your fertilizer. And it all helps to simplify and maximize the program. And also it means that when you buy your shopping list, you know you have the right products in the yard for when you'll need them across the year. Another thing which often gets maybe overlooked or sidelined when it comes to fertilizer planning is a good check of your equipment to make sure everything is working properly, because it's fine to have a very precise plan that maps out the rates of nutrients across the year, but your equipment needs to match that in terms of the ability to spread your fertilizer correctly at different rates. So when it comes to fertilizer, and there's some very good resources available for this, both between spreader manufacturers and some of the information from Teagasc and the Fertilizer Association of Ireland and other places. But things like spreader calibration and linking that to fertilizer density and granule size, there are tests and tray tests and all that available for that. The heights and levels of your fertilizer, even on your tractor, even very simple things like the length of the top link and having the lift arms level, all make a difference in terms of even spreading. Knowing the spreading width that you're working at and the correct settings in terms of vanes and so on. Having your tractor set up that you know what the forward speed is. And finally, matching bout widths and headland management and all of those facilities, if they're available on the fertilizer spreader, all of those working correctly and accurately is very important to make sure that if you plan to spread whatever rate in a field, that is what actually goes out in that field and that is spread as evenly as possible. And also in relation to slurry, 2 very important things that get overlooked with slurry. First of all, again, to make the point between dilute slurry and thick slurry, diluted slurry has diluted nutrients. So if you're spreading dilute slurry, it is not the same as spreading the same rate of thick slurry in terms of nutrient content, and to be aware of that. As well as that, when it comes to your slurry spreader, your calibration of your slurry application rate is as important as your fertilizer. So knowing your forward spread, estimating your spread width, and particularly with splash plate applicators, the spread width can be variable with different slurry thicknesses and so on, and that may need to be calibrated as you go. The time to empty the tanker, and there's some very useful calibration charts available online and in other places that can help with simplifying the calculations of the application rate based on those 3 simple things of forward speed, spread width, and time to empty the tanker. And I suppose it's a statement, it might be a silly statement to say, but it is important. 1,000 gallons per acre is not the same as 3,000 gallons per acre. And just to know your application rate can be very important, because oftentimes you can think that you're doing a great job maybe getting slurry to silage ground, but if the rate is lower than you think and the slurry is more dilute than you think, you could be only spreading a quarter of or a half of the nutrients you might actually need or have planned to have spread. Final point in terms of implementing the plan is to consider keeping a record. And the most helpful thing when it comes to preparing a plan next year is knowing what having the records for the previous year. It helps you to determine how are the soil test results moving over time. If your fertilizer plan is a fertility maintenance plan, well then knowing do the records match the plan will help you determine is the plan right for the farmer, doesn't need to be adjusted to achieve that outcome. Likewise, if you're building fertility, the same is true. Likewise, do the soil tests and their nutrient application rates help explain yield differences? There might be fields on the farm which are disappointed with the performance of. If you have the fertilizer records combined with soil test results, that's a way of differentiating. Is something different happening in the soil or the nutrient application rates in that field which could be addressed? Or is it another issue such as the grass species or the need for reseeding or something like that? Third point about records is how much am I spending? Am I getting a return? And that's a very important aspect of it as well in terms of analysing your fertilizer costs, particularly against your revenue, and making sure that your fertilizer and your nutrient costs are appropriate to the return you're getting from them. And finally, to make the point that records is not just about fertilizer applications, it's as important to have the information on where lime has been spread or where slurry has been spread, because that equally impacts and helps when it comes to putting the fertilizer plan together in the future as well. So finally, in summary, to sum up the last 30 minutes or so, I suppose the key points again are: have a fertilizer plan in place for the farm. It's the best way to make sure you get value for money from the money you're going to spend on fertilizer and on nutrients. It's very important in terms of making sure your farm is balanced from a production and sustainability point of view. And it also means that when things are busy, when you're at busy times of the year, when fertilizer is one of the jobs that needs to be done, but there is competition for your time and your labor, having a simple fertilizer plan that makes those decisions easy when the pressure is on can be a big help. We mentioned focusing on the priorities, lime being a priority, getting your plan prepared that's appropriate in terms of NPK, sulfur and other nutrients in terms of the soil, the system and the stocking rate. Remember, nutrient timing is as or even more important as the nutrient rate, particularly with nutrients like nitrogen and also phosphorus and K as well, with every nutrient really. And also take special attention to mine silage ground and match that with slurry as much as possible, because silage and grazing are different in terms of their nutrient requirements. And if you don't treat them differently, you will end up exhausting the soil fertility in silage fields very quickly. And finally, keep it simple. The planning preparation process is complicated. There's a lot of complicated calculations in the background, but the final plan must be simple. And whether you're getting one prepared for you, somebody can do those complicated calculations for you, or if you're doing it yourself, make sure that what you have as a finished product is simple, easy to follow, easy to implement. Maps can be a good addition where they're available. Keep the information simple, particularly at each timing. Get your equipment right in terms of fertilizer and slurry application, the setup and the calibrations. And when you do spread your fertilizer and slurry, keep a record, and it'll be a big help for your plan for next year and years beyond to make sure your fertilizer plan is delivering the result that you wanted to deliver. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.